Esther Galak, who is also from Victoria, where I'm from, and is also a studio technician. So hello, Esther. Asks if you can use bentonite instead of Epsom salt. So I talked about flocculation. Flocculation is a way of increasing a glaze's viscosity without adjusting the specific gravity, without changing the water content. And flocculating your glaze can help if you have a glaze that's hard panning, where your glaze is having trouble staying suspended in the bucket. Then one solution for that is to flocculate your glaze, because sometimes the materials that are in our glaze recipes will have a deflocculating effect. So we might have a glaze recipe that has a sufficient amount of clay in it, because we need clay in our glazes in order to keep them suspended in the bucket. So to answer Esther's question, she's saying, well, could you just add bentonite instead of flocculating to deal with a glaze that is having trouble staying suspended in the bucket? And so in that case, yes, definitely. I always like to fix the recipe, if I can, first before I make changes to the bucket. So I would rather add clay to my glaze recipe in the form of bentonite to help with suspension problems. And so the first thing, if I have a glaze that's hard panning, I'm looking at the recipe, I'm checking the clay content. If it's really low in clay content, then I'm checking, is there bentonite added? If there's no bentonite, then that would be the first step that I would take, is I would add 1 to 2% bentonite to the glaze recipe. I would add some bentonite to the bucket, see if that helps keep the glaze in suspension. If the glaze already has plenty of clay and or bentonite and it's still having trouble staying suspended, then that's an indication to me that there's an ingredient in the glaze that is causing it to be deflocculated. And sometimes when a glaze is deflocculated, the deflocculating of clay particles, when they're deflocculated, they lose their suspending properties, and so they can really struggle to keep the glaze suspended in the bucket. And so in that case, if my glaze has sufficient clay and it already contains bentonite, then I would look to flocculating the glaze to help with suspension problems, rather than just adding more and more bentonite. So there's different reasons why I would choose bentonite if there wasn't already bentonite in the glaze recipe and it was having trouble staying suspended, then I would use bentonite. If there was already bentonite, then I would turn to flocculation. Carla on Instagram says, yes, I love bentonite, especially when my recipe is lacking of raw kaolin, since I'm using calcined kaolin mostly. Yeah, and another thing, so if your recipe contains calcined kaolin, that is kaolin that has been fired to a temperature to drive off the chemically bound water molecules. And so the calcined kaolin no longer has the ability to keep glazes in suspension. And so you could add bentonite. You could also replace some of the calcined kaolin with uncalcined kaolin. It depends on the glaze that you're working with. Sometimes we have calcined kaolin for other reasons. And so you could either add bentonite or you could replace some calcined kaolin with uncalcined kaolin. Both of those things would help with keeping your glaze suspended in the bucket.